May 7, 1945, and the world was celebrating like never before because Victory in Europe Day had finally arrived. The war against Nazi Germany was over. Millions of people flooded the streets of London and Paris and New York, dancing and crying and holding each other tight. But inside the White House, something absolutely bizarre was unfolding, something that would remain hidden for decades. President Harry Truman had just gathered his newly assembled staff around him, and he gave them an order that seemed completely impossible to believe. He looked at them with tired eyes and said firmly, "I don't want to hear that name in this building, not for a while. We clear?" His press secretary Charlie Ross shifted uncomfortably and asked carefully, "Which name exactly are you talking about, Mr. President?" Truman's jaw tightened and his voice dropped low. "You know damn well which name I'm talking about. Roosevelt, Franklin, FDR, any version of it. I don't want to hear it unless it's absolutely necessary for official business. Pass the word to everyone." What happened next was extraordinary. This unofficial ban lasted 6 entire months, from May all the way through October of 1945. And during that time, White House staffers learned to talk around the previous president's name, like he had simply never existed at all. They would say things like the previous administration, or they'd just say before, or sometimes they'd leave these awkward, painful silences where Roosevelt's name should have been. And new employees who joined the White House during those months were quietly pulled aside by the veterans who whispered urgently, "Listen carefully. Don't mention Roosevelt around Truman unless you want to watch a man's face turn purple with absolute rage." But here's the question that makes this story so fascinating. What could possibly make a president so angry, so deeply furious, that he couldn't even bear to hear his predecessor's name spoken out loud? The answer reveals one of the most toxic and dysfunctional relationships in the entire history of American presidents. And the breaking point came on May 6th, just one day before VE Day itself. Truman had been president for less than a month at this point, and he was absolutely drowning in impossible decisions. He had to figure out how to end the war with Japan. He had to manage this incredibly delicate alliance with Stalin, and he was trying desperately to understand something called the Manhattan Project that Roosevelt had completely hidden from him. He was working 18-hour days, sleeping maybe 4 hours a night if he was lucky, living on nothing but coffee and pure adrenaline, and everywhere he turned, someone was telling him what Roosevelt would have done in this situation. People kept saying things like, "Mr. President, when President Roosevelt handled this particular situation," or "the Roosevelt approach was always," or "FDR always said," and it was driving Truman absolutely insane. That afternoon, Truman was sitting in a meeting about post-war economic policy with his entire cabinet, and Henry Morgenthau, who had been Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary, was explaining his plan for Germany after the war. Morgenthau wanted to destroy Germany's industrial capacity entirely. He wanted to turn the whole country into an agricultural nation that could never threaten Europe again. It was called the Morgenthau Plan, and Roosevelt had tentatively endorsed it at the Quebec Conference back in 1944. Morgenthau kept invoking Roosevelt's memory over and over. He kept saying President Roosevelt understood that Germany must be punished severely. President Roosevelt agreed with me that half measures wouldn't work at all. President Roosevelt wanted, and then Truman interrupted him sharply. "President Roosevelt is dead," Truman said, and the entire room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Morgenthau looked absolutely stunned. His face went pale. Truman continued speaking, and his voice was tight with controlled fury. "President Roosevelt has been dead for nearly a month now. I am the president, and I think your plan is absolutely insane. It would create 50 million starving Germans who would become easy prey for communist agitation. It would destabilize all of Europe. So no, we're not doing it." Meeting adjourned. Truman stood up and walked out of the room, leaving Morgenthau sitting there completely humiliated in front of the entire cabinet. But that confrontation was just the surface of what was really going on. What happened later that evening revealed the real depth of Truman's anger and pain. Charlie Ross came to the Oval Office around 8 o'clock that night, and he found Truman sitting alone in the dark, with a glass of bourbon in his hand. Ross turned on a light, and he could see that Truman looked completely exhausted and furious at the same time. Ross asked him what was wrong, and Truman's response was bitter and raw. "Do you know what I found today, Charlie, in Roosevelt's desk? Do you want to know what that son of a gun left me?" Truman pulled out a folder and threw it hard across the desk. Ross picked it up carefully and started reading through it, his face growing pale as he went. It was a memorandum that Roosevelt had written back in February of 1945, just 2 months before his death, and it was titled, "Concerns Regarding the Vice President." In this memo, Roosevelt had documented all his doubts about Truman's capability to handle the presidency. He wrote that Truman was a small-minded machine politician from Missouri who lacked the vision and intellect required for global leadership on the world stage. Roosevelt actually suggested that maybe the party should consider replacing Truman on the ticket in 1948, if Roosevelt managed to survive his 4th term. And if Roosevelt didn't survive, the memo suggested that the cabinet should provide extensive guidance and oversight to make sure Truman didn't make catastrophic mistakes that would damage the country. But there was even more that Truman had discovered. He told Ross about other things he'd found over the past 3 weeks that had been eating away at him. He had found correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, where FDR had made commitments about post-war Eastern Europe that were far more extensive than what was publicly known to anyone. Roosevelt had essentially agreed to Soviet domination of Poland and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria in exchange for Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. And now Truman was stuck with these secret agreements that he had never been consulted about and that he fundamentally disagreed with on every level. He had discovered that Roosevelt had been excluding him from major decisions deliberately and systematically. It wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was intentional policy. There were notes showing that Roosevelt had told his advisors not to brief Truman on sensitive matters because, quote, "he doesn't need to know yet." Roosevelt had kept his own vice president away from cabinet meetings, away from diplomatic negotiations, away from military briefings, and the Manhattan Project was just the most dramatic example of this pattern. Truman had been vice president for 82 days total, and he had met alone with Roosevelt exactly twice for a combined total of maybe 30 minutes. That wasn't accidental at all. It was intentional isolation. Roosevelt had deliberately frozen him out. Truman had also learned something that enraged him on a deeply personal level. Roosevelt had never actually wanted him as vice president in the first place. The party bosses had forced Truman onto the ticket at the 1944 Democratic Convention because Henry Wallace was considered too left-wing and too controversial for a wartime ticket. Roosevelt had resented this imposition, and he had taken out his resentment by freezing Truman out completely. Roosevelt had treated his own vice president with absolute contempt, and now Truman was supposed to honor his memory and continue his legacy as if nothing was wrong. Ross asked the obvious question that was hanging in the air. Why not just tell people the truth about how Roosevelt had treated him? Why not let the American people know what really happened? Truman's answer revealed his impossible dilemma. "Because I can't, Charlie. The country needs to believe in Roosevelt right now. The war isn't over yet. We still have Japan to defeat. The alliance with Britain and the Soviets is incredibly fragile. If I start attacking Roosevelt's memory, I look petty and small. I look like I'm making excuses for my own inadequacy. The press would absolutely destroy me. So I have to smile and pretend I'm honored to continue his legacy, while privately dealing with the absolute mess he left me." The next day was VE Day. and Truman had to give a national address to the entire country. He knew that millions of Americans expected him to praise Roosevelt extensively and credit him with leading America to victory in Europe. Truman wrote a speech that mentioned Roosevelt exactly once in a brief acknowledgement. He said President Roosevelt did not live to see this day, but we know he shares in our victory. And that was it. One single sentence. His speechwriters had written much more extensive tributes to FDR originally, but Truman cut all of it out with his pen. Every word. The press noticed immediately, and some newspapers actually criticized Truman for not showing proper respect to his predecessor on this monumentally important day in history. That's when Truman gave his staff the informal ban on Roosevelt's name. He couldn't publicly attack Roosevelt without destroying himself politically. But he also couldn't stand hearing these constant comparisons and invocations of Roosevelt's memory every single day. So he created this bubble inside the White House where Roosevelt simply wasn't discussed unless it was absolutely necessary for government business. Staff members quickly learned to navigate this strange prohibition, and they developed all kinds of euphemisms and workarounds. Cabinet memos started referring to previous policy instead of Roosevelt's policy. Meetings would discuss changing course from prior decisions rather than reversing Roosevelt's approach. Everyone was dancing around the elephant in the room. The ban created some truly bizarre situations that must have felt surreal to everyone involved. Eleanor Roosevelt would visit the White House occasionally to collect personal items or to discuss United Nations matters since she was involved in that. And staff members would warn each other nervously, "Mrs. Roosevelt is coming today. Be very careful." And it wasn't because Eleanor was difficult or unpleasant. She was actually quite gracious. But her very presence made it almost impossible to avoid mentioning her husband's name and policies. Truman was always polite to Eleanor when she visited, but their conversations were incredibly strained and awkward. Both of them dancing around the elephant in the room, neither quite willing to address the tension directly. One incident in June of 1945 revealed just how deeply this ban went and how seriously people had to take it. A young State Department aide was giving Truman a briefing on Soviet demands regarding Poland, and the aide said, "Mr. President." At Yalta, President Roosevelt agreed to, and Truman cut him off sharply before he could finish. "I've read the Yalta agreements already," Truman said. "Just tell me what the Soviets are demanding right now, today." The aide got flustered and tried to continue. "Well, sir, they're citing President Roosevelt's commitment to," and Truman actually stood up from his chair. "Are you deaf?" he said. "I told you to tell me what they want now, not what Roosevelt promised them months ago." The aide left that meeting completely shaken, and word spread quickly through the White House. Mentioning Roosevelt directly to Truman was basically career suicide at this point. You just didn't do it if you valued your job. But Truman's anger went beyond Roosevelt's specific decisions, or even beyond that memo calling him incompetent. There was something much deeper eating at him that went back years. Truman had spent his entire political career being underestimated and dismissed by people who thought they were better than him. He came from a political machine in Kansas City that was run by a man named Tom Pendergast, and this gave Truman a permanent reputation as a hack and a stooge, someone who couldn't think for himself. He had been elected to the Senate back in 1934, and he had to fight constantly for respect from colleagues who saw him as nothing more than Pendergast's errand boy. They didn't take him seriously at all. He had worked incredibly hard for years. He chaired important committees. He built a genuine reputation for integrity and competence. He exposed waste in military spending during the war, and still he was dismissed as a lightweight who didn't belong in the big leagues. When Roosevelt picked him as vice president in 1944, Truman thought it was finally validation of everything he'd worked for. He thought Roosevelt saw something valuable in him, that Roosevelt believed in his capabilities and his potential. Now he knew the devastating truth. Roosevelt hadn't picked him at all. The party bosses had forced Truman on Roosevelt against his will, and FDR had responded by treating him like an unwanted burden that he was stuck with. Everything Truman had achieved in his career meant absolutely nothing to Roosevelt. He was just the machine politician from Missouri in Roosevelt's eyes. Not worth briefing, not worth trusting, not worth preparing for the very real possibility that he might actually become president someday. The psychological toll this took on Truman was severe, and it affected him deeply. He became almost paranoid about comparisons to Roosevelt in the press. When newspapers ran stories analyzing how Truman was handling situations differently than FDR would have handled them, Truman would fly into private rages in the Oval Office. He would yell and curse and throw things. He told his staff repeatedly that he was sick of being judged against a ghost, sick of being told he wasn't measuring up to a man who had deliberately sabotaged his ability to succeed in this job. It wasn't fair, and it was eating him alive. The pressure on Truman during these months was absolutely immense and almost unbearable. He was making literal life-and-death decisions about atomic bombs and Soviet expansion and the future of Europe, while simultaneously being told by pundits and politicians and newspapers that he was no Franklin Roosevelt, that he would never measure up. In July, Truman traveled to Potsdam for a conference, and this was finally his chance to step out of Roosevelt's shadow and establish himself, meeting with Stalin and Churchill, and later with Clement Attlee after Churchill lost the British election. Truman took a much firmer line with the Soviets than Roosevelt had ever taken. He wasn't going to roll over. When Stalin made his usual demands about reparations from Germany and control of Eastern European governments, Truman pushed back hard and refused to give in. This was noticed immediately by everyone at the conference. Stalin reportedly told his interpreter privately, "This is not the same as dealing with Roosevelt. This one actually has a spine. He's not going to be pushed around like the other one was." But even at Potsdam, Roosevelt's ghost continued to haunt Truman and make his life difficult. The Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov kept referencing what Roosevelt had supposedly promised at Yalta, insisting that Truman had to honor those commitments because they were binding agreements. Truman's response was blunt and direct. "I didn't make those promises," he said. "I'm not bound by private agreements that I was never told about. Roosevelt is dead. You're dealing with me now. And I have very different views about how cooperative we're going to be with Soviet expansion into Europe." The American press covering the Potsdam Conference wrote stories about how Truman was abandoning Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation with the Soviets. They portrayed Truman as needlessly antagonistic, as lacking Roosevelt's diplomatic finesse and charm and ability to work with Stalin. Truman read these stories back in Washington, and he just seethed with anger. He was being blamed for not continuing Roosevelt's policy of appeasing Stalin, a policy that Truman believed had been incredibly naive and had already led directly to Soviet domination of half of Europe. But he still couldn't defend himself without attacking Roosevelt publicly and destroying his own political standing. August 6, 1945, Truman authorized the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima. Then 3 days later, another one hit Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th, and the war was finally over. Truman had made the most consequential decision of the entire 20th century. It was a decision that Roosevelt had set in motion by funding the Manhattan Project, but Roosevelt never had to actually make himself. He died before that moment came, and immediately people started asking the question, would Roosevelt have done it? Would FDR have actually used the atomic bomb? The speculation drove Truman absolutely crazy, because Roosevelt hadn't briefed him on the Manhattan Project at all, hadn't shared his thinking about how the weapon should be used, hadn't prepared him in any way, and had left Truman to make this impossible choice with completely inadequate preparation and information. In September, 5 months into the informal ban, Truman had a conversation with his wife Bess that revealed just how much Roosevelt's treatment still haunted him every single day. Bess mentioned casually that someone had suggested naming something after Roosevelt, maybe a building or a memorial, or a government program to honor his legacy. Truman's response was ice cold. "Let them do it," he said. "I don't care what they name after him, but they're not getting me to dedicate it or speak at it. I'm done pretending I have warm feelings about that man." Bess, who rarely challenged Harry on anything, said quietly, "You can't keep nursing this grudge forever, Harry. People are going to notice eventually. It's not healthy." Truman shot back, "Let them notice. I don't care anymore. I spent 82 days as vice president being treated like I was too stupid to be trusted with basic information. Now I'm supposed to be grateful for the privilege of cleaning up his messes?" The ban finally started to lift gradually in October of 1945, about 6 months after it had begun, and several things had changed by that point. First, Truman had proven himself to the country and to the world. He had made incredibly tough decisions about the atomic bomb and Japan's surrender terms, and standing up to Soviet aggression. He had established his own identity as president that was separate from Roosevelt's shadow. He didn't need to avoid Roosevelt's name anymore because he wasn't being compared to Roosevelt quite as much. People were starting to evaluate him on his own terms finally. Second, Truman had started to separate his personal anger at Roosevelt from his understanding of Roosevelt's genuine historical importance to the country. He could acknowledge that Roosevelt had led America through the Great Depression and through a world war, that he had fundamentally transformed the relationship between the federal government and ordinary citizens. This didn't mean Truman had to like Roosevelt personally or forgive how he had been treated, but it meant he could speak Roosevelt's name without pure rage clouding his judgment anymore. The first time Truman publicly praised Roosevelt after the informal ban ended was at a Democratic Party event in late October of 1945. He said carefully, "President Roosevelt built the foundation of our victory. We are harvesting what he planted for us." It was hardly effusive praise. It was pretty minimal, actually. But it was more than the bare minimum he had been offering for 6 long months, and his staff noticed immediately the ban was over. They could breathe again. But here's the thing. Truman never really forgave Roosevelt. Not deep down in his heart. In private letters and diary entries over the years that followed, Truman remained bitter about how he had been treated during those 82 days. In 1947, he wrote to his sister, "Roosevelt was a great president in many ways, that's undeniable, but he was also selfish and incredibly short-sighted about succession. He left this country and his vice president completely unprepared for what came after him because he couldn't accept his own mortality. He thought he was immortal." In 1952, when he was leaving office after deciding not to run again, Truman wrote in his personal diary, "I accomplished things Roosevelt never could have accomplished because I wasn't blinded by my own legend the way he was. He thought he was absolutely indispensable to the country. I knew I was just a man doing a job that needed to be done." The most revealing moment came much later in 1960 during interviews for a book about his presidency. Truman was asked directly by the interviewer, "Did you admire President Roosevelt as a leader?" Truman paused for a long moment, thinking carefully about his answer, and then he said, "I admired what he accomplished for the country. I genuinely did, but I did not admire how he treated people who worked for him. He could be cruel in these casual, thoughtless ways, dismissive of people he thought were beneath him intellectually or socially, and I was one of those people in his eyes." When the interviewer pressed further and asked if Roosevelt had deliberately sabotaged him, Truman replied carefully, "I think Roosevelt was in deep denial about dying. He convinced himself that he would recover from his health problems. So he didn't prepare anyone to take over because in his mind, he wasn't planning to give up power anytime soon. That's just human nature, I suppose. But it was also deeply irresponsible. A president has a solemn duty to prepare for succession. Roosevelt failed that duty completely, and I paid the price for his failure. And frankly, America paid the price too. Years later, after both men were long dead, historians discovered even more evidence that validated Truman's anger and resentment completely. Roosevelt had instructed his staff explicitly to minimize Truman's access to sensitive information. There were memos proving it. He had mocked Truman's intelligence in private conversations with advisors, and he had expressed genuine regret about having to accept him as his running mate. It was all documented. The informal ban on Roosevelt's name, which had once seemed petty and small-minded to some people, now made perfect sense to historians who understood the full context. It represented a man who had been pushed beyond his breaking point by being constantly underestimated and disrespected. He was someone who knew that expressing his rage openly would destroy him politically and damage the country. So he created the only private space he could where he didn't have to pretend everything was fine. Truman's presidency vindicated him completely in the end and proved all his doubters wrong. He integrated the armed forces through executive order. He stood up firmly to Soviet expansion in Europe. He rebuilt Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. He recognized the state of Israel and he established NATO as a defensive alliance. He made mistakes too, of course, including firing Douglas MacArthur in a way that damaged his popularity badly. But by the time he left office in 1953, he had established his own powerful legacy that stood on its own. He was no longer just Roosevelt's successor or Roosevelt's shadow. He was Harry Truman, the president who made the tough calls that Roosevelt had avoided making, the man from Missouri who nobody expected to succeed, but who proved everyone wrong. The informal ban on Roosevelt's name remains one of the strangest and most unusual episodes in the entire history of the White House. It seems bizarre when you first hear about it. But when you understand the full context and the full story, when you know what Roosevelt did to Truman and how deeply it hurt him, it makes perfect sense. It's actually completely understandable, sometimes even the most powerful person in the world. The President of the United States needs permission to be angry about how they've been treated, needs space to process their hurt and betrayal without pretending everything is fine. Truman gave himself that permission in the only way he could without destroying his presidency or damaging the country during a critical time. He banned a name for 6 months, not because he was petty or small-minded, but because he was human, because he was hurting, and because sometimes even presidents need to protect their own hearts while they do the impossible job of leading a nation through crisis after crisis after crisis.